Now, when we look at who is actually impacted by the CSRD, and especially that new scope I just mentioned, there are 4 groups of companies to have in mind. The first one being companies already subject to the NFRD. So the main change that will happen for those companies is really the change in the content and the format of reporting, right? Because these companies will already be aware that they are in scope. They were already obligated to conduct that non-financial reporting. The only thing that's changing for them is how they do it and what information they provide. The second group of companies that are impacted is the companies that we call newly in scope, i.e. the main change that was brought by the CSRD is reducing the thresholds of companies that need to do the reporting. And the kind of flagship or instrumental change that was brought there is reducing the threshold on the number of employees of companies that are impacted from 500 employees to 250 employees. The companies newly in scope are basically those that reach 2 of the following criteria, i.e. having more than 250 employees or a turnover of 50 million or a balance sheet of 25 million euros per year. The third bucket of companies is listed SMEs, except for micro enterprises, and the fourth bucket is non-EU groups with EU sales of more than 150 million euros for 2 consecutive years and with an EU subsidiary. Now, if we look at so this is kind of scope of application, but what the key thing to have in mind for this is that the timeline of implementation of the CSRD will be different for each of those categories. So in terms of timeline of implementation of the CSRD, the first thing to mention and to remind everyone just in terms of purely regulatory kind of aspect is that the CSRD is a directive. It means that member states are required to transpose it into national regulation within a certain time frame. Interestingly, because this is a key priority for the Commission, the timeline for transposition is relatively tight, meaning that member states are expected to transpose all the requirements of the CSRD within the national regulation by July 2024. Some countries like France have already stated that they will get it done. France is expected to do it by the end of this year. Other member states who have a bit more difficulties and will need more time to do it have already kind of said that they'll need more time. But this is certainly for our team as policy and regulation experts, a space that we'll watch next year, because what can happen also in a transposition of a directive is that certain thresholds, certain requirements are enhanced, and that requirements at the national level are potentially slightly different than what the Commission has asked for. So that's space to watch. But in terms of the timeline that is common for everyone and that is in a directive and that cannot be moved away from, is the incremental timeline of entry into force of all those requirements for the 4 buckets of companies I just talked about. The first deadline, and also why we wanted to have this webinar now, is coming into place in January 2024 for those companies that were already subject to the NFRD. Those companies will need to start collecting data in line with the CSRD requirements from January and report on this data in 2025 in the non-financial reporting. And then the same applies for the remaining group of companies over time. So in January 2025, for companies newly in scope for the CSRD, in January 2026 for SMEs, and in January 2028 for other non-European companies.